The tower at Bagram Airfield fell silent at 13:47 hours. Not the comfortable silence of a slow afternoon, but the kind that makes your throat tighten. Captain Reina Ghost Vasquez was 43 minutes overdue. Her Thunderbolt II, callsign Warthog 23, had been conducting close air support over the Kunar Valley when her transponder blinked off the screen like a candle in wind. The last transmission was garbled, something about ground fire and hydraulics, then nothing but static that sounded like the earth swallowing words whole. Major Chen stood in the operations center staring at the empty space on the radar where she should have been, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Nobody wanted to say it first. Nobody wanted to make it real. Reina had been flying A-10s for 11 years, back when people still made jokes about letting women into combat roles, back when proving yourself meant doing everything twice as well for half the recognition. She'd earned her callsign not from being invisible but from the opposite, from appearing exactly when Taliban positions thought they were safe, emerging from mountain shadows at Angels 5, that distinctive growl of her GAU-8 Avenger cannon announcing her arrival like thunder with intent. The 30mm rounds she delivered were precise, surgical, the kind of fire support that made ground troops weep with relief. But nicknames in the military are double-edged. Some pilots wore theirs like medals. Others carried them like scars that never quite healed. The sky over Kunar had been crystalline that morning, the kind of blue that made you forget about war for half a heartbeat. Reina had taken off at 6:23, her aircraft loaded with 11 Maverick missiles and a full complement of ammunition. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Okonkwo, flew Warthog 24, staying tight on her six as they climbed into the sunrise. They'd been tasked with supporting a Marine company pinned down near the Pakistan border, taking fire from 3 directions, their own air support delayed by mechanical issues. Reina didn't hesitate. She never did. The mission brief took 4 minutes. The pre-flight took 6. By 6:40 they were wheels up, pushing east toward mountains that looked like broken teeth against the morning light. The radio chatter had been routine for the first hour. Dash called out checkpoints. Reina confirmed. The forward air controller, callsign Anvil 36, provided coordinates with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this too many times. The Marines were dug in behind a collapsed compound, taking RPG fire from a ridgeline 800 meters north. Reina could see the smoke from 15 miles out, gray threads unraveling into sky. She armed her systems, checked her fuel, and dove. That's when the world turned inside out. The surface-to-air missile came from nowhere, a streak of white contrail and bad intentions. Reina broke hard left, flares spitting from her aircraft like fireflies fleeing darkness. The missile missed her tail by 30 feet, exploding in empty air with a sound like God tearing paper. But there was a second missile. There's always a second one. This one found her port engine, and the A-10 shuddered like a wounded animal trying to remember how to breathe. Warning lights turned her cockpit into a Christmas tree of emergencies. Her altitude dropped from 8,000 feet to 6,000 in seconds. 2-3 is hit, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the aircraft trying to roll inverted. Losing hydraulics, port engine out, switching to manual reversion. Her hands moved with muscle memory older than thought, cycling through procedures drilled into her soul. The A-10 was built to take punishment, engineered by designers who understood that war doesn't care about elegance. But there's taking damage and there's flying a machine that's actively dying around you. Reina was doing the latter. Dash pulled alongside, his aircraft pristine against her smoking wreck. "Ghost, you need to punch out. Eject now." His voice cracked at the edges, professional training fighting against the knowledge that they'd flown together for 2 years, that he'd been at her promotion ceremony, that she'd talked him through his divorce over terrible base coffee at 3 in the morning. Reina didn't answer immediately. Below her, the Marines were still pinned. The ridgeline was still hot. The mission wasn't finished. -24. Anvil 36 still needs fire support. I'm still flying. She said it like she was discussing the weather, not piloting 40,000 pounds of crippled aircraft with one engine and hydraulic fluid painting her fuselage in dark streaks. She lined up her attack run, compensating for the list to port, her right hand white-knuckled on the stick. The GAU-8 spun up with its familiar whine, that 7-barrel rotary cannon that weighed more than a small car and could fire 65 rounds per second. The recoil shook her damaged aircraft like a paint mixer, but the tracers walked right up the ridgeline, finding enemy positions with the precision of someone who'd spent a decade learning exactly where to put hate when hate was needed. The Taliban position disintegrated under her fire. Secondary explosions bloomed orange and black. The Marines below pushed forward, seizing the moment she'd bought them with blood and aluminum. Dash watched from altitude, helpless, as Raina pulled up from her run, her A-10 trailing smoke like a dying star trying to remember what light looked like. Her port wing had taken damage too, she realized now. Something structural. The aircraft wanted to roll right, fighting her every second. 2-3, you've done enough. Punch out and let the bird go. Dash's voice held everything unsaid, all the futures that vanished if she stayed with the aircraft too long. Raina checked her instruments, calculating distances and fuel and whether the math of survival still worked in her favor. The base was 60 miles west. She had one engine at 70% power, compromised flight controls, and a wing that might separate if she stressed it wrong. The equation didn't balance. But Raina had never been good at math that said quit. I'm bringing her home, she said, and turned west into the wind that felt like judgment. Dash stayed with her, flying close enough to count the rivets in her damaged wing, ready to call in rescue helicopters the moment she went down. They both knew she was flying on borrowed time and stubbornness, that physics would eventually collect its debt with interest. The mountains passed below them in shades of brown and gray, indifferent to human drama. At 30 miles out, her remaining engine temperature spiked. The warnings became urgent, a synthesized voice telling her things she already knew. Raina reduced throttle, trading speed for engine life, gambling that she could glide further than the fire could catch. At 20 miles out, a piece of her port wing separated, just peeled away and tumbled toward Earth like a metallic leaf. The A-10 lurched, became harder to control, wanted to spiral into the ground and end this story with impact and finality. Raina fought the stick, arms burning, sweat stinging her eyes behind her visor. She talked to the aircraft like it could hear her, like words could replace hydraulic fluid and structural integrity. Come on, girl, stay with me, just a little further. Dash called out her altitude, her airspeed, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. 15 miles. 10. The base appeared on the horizon. Runway lights already activated for emergency landing. Fire trucks positioned like priests at a funeral that might still be prevented. At 5 miles, her engine quit entirely. Just stopped, went from laboring roar to windmilling silence in one heartbeat. The A-10 became a glider, dropping altitude at 800 feet per minute, converting height into distance with the efficiency of desperation. Raina dumped everything that could be dumped, external stores, emergency fuel, everything that added weight without adding hope. The aircraft lightened, the glide ratio improved by fractions that might mean everything or nothing. The base tower watched her approach, a crippled aircraft barely maintaining controlled flight, missing half a port wing, trailing smoke, one engine cold and the other one gone entirely. Someone whispered a prayer in Spanish, someone else in Mandarin, but hope translates the same in every language. Raina lined up on final approach. No engine power for a go-around, no second chances, just gravity and skill, and the question of whether skill could negotiate with gravity one more time. Her training said eject, her heart said land, her hands made the choice without consulting either. She came in steep, compensating for the missing wing surface, fighting the crosswind that wanted to flip her inverted. The runway rushed up to meet her, concrete that looked like salvation or grave depending on the next 10 seconds. Her remaining main landing gear touched down first, then the nose gear, then the aircraft slammed onto its belly as the damaged port side collapsed completely. Sparks showered behind her like a comet losing faith. She skidded 2,000 feet, metal screaming against concrete, before physics finally agreed to let her stop. The fire trucks converged before the dust settled. Raina sat in the cockpit for 3 full seconds, hands still on the controls, before she began the shutdown procedures for systems that were already shut down by virtue of being destroyed. Her fingers trembled now, adrenaline debt coming due. Dash landed behind her, was out of his cockpit and running toward her aircraft before his crew chief could stop him. The canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like the universe exhaling. "Ghost, you absolute lunatic," Dash said, his voice caught between relief and rage and something closer to awe. Reyna unbuckled with hands that didn't quite work right, muscles remembering the fight before her mind could process it. She looked at her aircraft, at what remained of it. The port wing was gone past the weapons pylon, the engine nacelle was scorched black, and the fuselage was stitched with holes that shouldn't have allowed flight at all. It looked like it had gone to war with physics and lost, but it had brought her home anyway. "She deserved better," Reyna said quietly, placing one hand on the cockpit rail like saying goodbye to a friend who'd paid too high a price for someone else's survival. The maintenance chief arrived, took one look at the aircraft and shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I've been working on A-10s for 23 years. I have no idea how you flew this back. I'm not sure you should have been able to." Reyna climbed down carefully, legs uncertain on solid ground. "She's a warthog. They don't quit." "Neither do I," she didn't say, but everyone heard it anyway. The debrief lasted 4 hours. Reyna sat across from Major Chen and 2 colonels she didn't recognize, walking them through every decision, every system failure, every moment where the mission could have ended differently. They asked about the ejection decision. She explained the Marines on the ground, the fire support they'd needed, the tactical situation that didn't allow for personal comfort. One colonel frowned. The other one nodded slowly, understanding passing across his face like weather changing. "Captain Vasquez," he said finally, "what you did today was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've encountered in 30 years of service. I haven't decided which." Reyna met his eyes, steady, exhausted. "Does it matter, sir? The Marines walked out. The aircraft came home." The colonel was quiet for a long moment. "No, Captain, I suppose it doesn't." He made a note in his file, something she couldn't read from across the table. Major Chen watched her with an expression she couldn't quite parse, part concern, part respect, part something else entirely. The story spread through the base like wildfire through dry grass. By sunset, every pilot in the ready room had heard about Ghost bringing back the wreck, flying on skill and spite. By the next morning, the photographs were circulating, her A-10 on the runway, barely recognizable as something that should fly. Maintenance crews came to look at it like tourists at a monument, taking pictures, shaking their heads in disbelief. Someone measured the missing wing section. 43% of the port wing was gone. "You flew half an airplane home," a young crew chief said, voice full of wonder. Reyna shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It was a really good half." But the respect came slowly, grudgingly, the way institutional change always does. Some pilots started calling her Iron Ghost, acknowledging the feat while maintaining distance. Others remained skeptical, suggesting luck played a larger role than skill. Reyna heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances, recognized the pattern. She'd been here before, proving herself in a field that measured worth in different units for different people. The only difference now was the wreckage on the runway that argued her case better than words ever could. 3 days later, the Marines she'd supported sent a message through official channels. It was formal, properly formatted, exactly the kind of thing that gets filed and forgotten. But attached was another message, handwritten, signed by every man in that company. "You gave us a tomorrow. We won't forget." Reyna read it alone in her quarters, reading it 3 times before she carefully folded it and put it in her locker, next to the picture of her daughter and the patch from her first squadron. Some things matter more than medals. The investigation board delivered their findings 2 weeks later. Pilot error was not listed. Exceptional airmanship was. The A-10 was deemed beyond economical repair, relegated to the boneyard where aircraft go to become spare parts for their still-flying siblings. Reyna attended the decision briefing, said nothing when they showed slides of the damage, remained quiet when they discussed maintenance costs versus replacement costs. When they asked if she had anything to add, she stood. That aircraft saved my life by refusing to quit. It deserves more than being scrapped for parts." The board chairman looked at her over his reading glasses, expression unreadable. "Noted, Captain, but sometimes service means sacrifice." He dismissed the board, ending the discussion with administrative finality. But Raina couldn't let it end that way. She started asking questions, making calls, navigating the bureaucratic maze that turned simple requests into epic quests. She learned about aircraft restoration programs, about museums that preserved military history, about the process of transferring ownership from active service to static display. She filled out forms in triplicate, made her case to people who had the power to make decisions or the authority to ignore her. Most chose the latter. The A-10 sat in a salvage yard, slowly being stripped of useful components, dying by degrees in the Afghan sun. 6 weeks after the incident, a general she'd never met requested her presence at his office. Raina reported exactly on time, spine straight, uniform perfect, ready for whatever consequence her persistence had earned. The general was older, weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too many funerals and learned to carry the weight without showing it. He gestured for her to sit. "Captain Vasquez, you're making a lot of noise about an airplane." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, I am." "Tell me why." He leaned back, studying her with eyes that missed nothing. Raina took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, that aircraft took a missile hit, lost an engine, lost half a wing, and still flew 60 miles to bring me home. It completed its mission while actively failing. That's not just engineering, that's heart. That's worth remembering." The general was quiet for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You know they call you Ghost because you're supposed to disappear after the job is done. You're not supposed to haunt us with inconvenient truths." "Sorry, sir, I'm not very good at disappearing." Raina met his gaze without flinching. The general almost smiled, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "No, Captain, you're really not." He pulled a folder from his desk, slid it across to her. "I've authorized the transfer of Warthog 2-3 to the National Museum of the United States Air Force. It'll be restored and displayed as an example of combat damage survivability and exceptional airmanship. That satisfy your sense of justice?" Raina opened the folder, saw the official documents, the authorization stamped and signed. Her throat tightened with something that might have been gratitude or might have been vindication or might have been the simple acknowledgement that sometimes fighting for the right thing actually works. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The general stood, offering his hand. "You're a pain in the ass, Captain Vasquez. The Air Force needs more like you." She shook his hand, smiled despite herself. "I'll take that as a compliment, sir." The day they transported the A-10 off the base, half the squadron came to watch. The aircraft sat on a flatbed truck, still bearing its wounds, still showing the holes in the missing wing section and the scorched metal that told its story better than any report. Raina stood at attention as it rolled past, rendering a salute that the aircraft couldn't return but seemed to deserve anyway. Dash stood beside her, quiet for once, understanding that some moments don't need commentary. "You gave her a legacy," he said finally. Raina watched the truck disappear toward the gate. "She earned it herself. I just made sure people would remember." 3 months later, Raina rotated back to the States, her deployment complete, her record marked by commendations and quiet conversations about what happens to pilots who don't know when to quit. She reported to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, drew a new aircraft, and continued flying like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Other pilots treated her differently now, not with the skepticism she'd learned to expect but with something closer to respect. The younger ones asked questions about the Kunar Valley, about the missile hit, about how you know when to eject and when to stay with the aircraft. "You don't know," Raina told them, honest in ways the training manuals couldn't be. "You make your best guess based on incomplete information and hope you're right. Sometimes the right decision looks stupid in hindsight. Sometimes the stupid decision turns out right. You do your best and accept the consequences." A young lieutenant, fresh from training, all confidence and untested courage, frowned at that answer. "But how do you decide? What's the metric?" Raina considered the question, remembering the moment when her engine quit at 5 miles out, when every rational calculation said eject. The metric is what you can live with when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning. Choose accordingly. The museum opened the A-10 exhibit 8 months after the incident. Raina received an invitation to the ceremony, official letterhead and formal wording requesting her presence for the unveiling. She almost didn't go. The idea of standing next to that aircraft while people took pictures and asked questions felt wrong somehow, like claiming glory she hadn't earned. But the museum director called personally, explained that the exhibit wasn't complete without her, that the story needed its protagonist. "It's not about glory, Captain, it's about truth. Come tell the truth." So she went, wearing her dress blues, medals she'd earned and some she thought she hadn't, standing before a crowd of veterans and families and aviation enthusiasts who'd come to see the wreck that flew home. The A-10 sat on a raised platform, carefully preserved in exactly the state it had landed, damaged, scarred, incomplete, magnificent. The missing wing section was displayed separately, like an artifact that explained everything without needing words. Beside it, a placard told the story in dry technical language that couldn't quite capture what had happened in that cockpit 60 miles from safety. The museum director introduced her, reading her record with a formality that made her uncomfortable. When he finished, Raina stepped to the microphone, looked out at the faces watching her and felt the weight of expectation. They wanted a hero's speech, probably. Wanted inspiration and patriotism and clean narratives about courage and duty. Raina cleared her throat. "This aircraft saved my life," she said simply. "Not because of anything special I did, but because the designers and engineers and maintenance crews who built and maintained it were so good at their jobs that it could survive the unsurvivable. The real heroes are the people who made sure it could take that damage and keep flying." She paused, looking at the A-10, remembering the smell of smoke and burning hydraulic fluid, the feel of the stick fighting her, the moment when everything could have ended differently. "I was just stubborn enough not to let go. The aircraft did the rest." The crowd applauded, but Raina wasn't finished. "There are Marines alive today because this machine refused to quit when every rational assessment said it should. That's what matters. Not the spectacle of the damage, but the fact that everyone involved went home. That's the mission. That's always the mission." After the ceremony, people lined up to talk to her, to shake her hand, to take pictures next to the aircraft. Raina endured it with the same patience she'd learned over a decade of proving herself, answering questions, deflecting praise back toward the ground crews and the engineers. An old veteran, easily 80, wearing a Vietnam-era flight suit and too many memories in his eyes, approached carefully. "I flew thuds over Hanoi," he said. "Lost a lot of friends to SAMs. What you did bringing that bird home, that's the kind of flying we needed more of." Raina didn't know what to say to that, to the weight of his generation's losses offered as validation of her own survival. She settled for, "Thank you for your service, sir." Dash showed up near the end, out of uniform, grinning like he'd won a bet with the universe. "Iron Ghost at a museum exhibit. Never thought I'd see the day." Raina rolled her eyes but couldn't quite hide her smile. "Shut up, Dash." They stood together looking at the aircraft, their shared history written in the metal and the missing wing and the story that would outlive them both. "You know," Dash said after a while, "I tell people I flew with you and they don't believe me. They think I'm exaggerating. Then they look it up and realize the story's actually crazier than anything I could invent." "It wasn't that crazy," Raina protested. "People bring back damaged aircraft all the time." Dash gave her a look that suggested she was being deliberately obtuse. "With 43% of a wing missing and no engines, name one other time." Raina couldn't. They both knew she couldn't. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, the kind that exists between people who have trusted each other with their lives. "You planning to keep flying?" Dash asked eventually. "Until they make me stop," Raina said. "I'm not done yet." The years pass the way they do in the military, measured in deployments and transfers, in missions that blur together until only the exceptional ones remain distinct. Raina made major, then lieutenant colonel, collecting rank and responsibility in equal measure. She trained younger pilots, teaching them the difference between courage and recklessness, between calculated risk and stupid chance. Some learned. Some had to learn the hard way. She watched them all with the patience of someone who remembered being underestimated, who understood that sometimes the best thing you can do is believe in people until they believe in themselves. Her daughter grew up sending emails to remote airfields, learning to live with a mother who served something larger than family but never forgot what family meant. They talked on grainy video calls when bandwidth allowed, sharing the small moments that build a life despite distance and duty. "Mom," her daughter asked once, 14 years old and sharp as Damascus steel, "do you ever regret it? The military, I mean. Missing so much." Raina considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but regret is complicated. I've done things that matter, saved lives, that's worth something. Even if it costs you things you can't get back." Her daughter's eyes were so much like her own, seeing through polite lies to uncomfortable truths. "Even then," Raina said quietly, "we all make choices about what we can live with. This is mine." Her daughter nodded slowly, accepting an answer that didn't quite satisfy but at least was honest. "When I grow up, I want to fly too." Raina felt something clench in her chest, pride and fear tangled so completely she couldn't separate them. "Then I'll teach you," she promised, "everything I know." The Kunar Valley incident became part of Air Force legend, the kind of story that gets told in ready rooms and training sessions, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, until Raina barely recognized herself in the heroic pilot who flew home on determination and duct tape. She corrected the record when she could, pushed back against mythologizing that made her superhuman instead of just stubborn. But myths serve their own purpose, and maybe the Air Force needed heroes more than it needed accuracy. She let it go mostly, focusing on the flying that still mattered more than the stories about flying. But sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Raina thought about that day. About the moment when the missile hit and the world became fire and warning lights. About the choice to stay with the aircraft, to complete the mission, to trust that the math of survival might work in her favor one more time. She wondered if she'd been brave or just lucky, heroic, or just too stubborn to know when to quit. The answer probably didn't matter. The Marines had gone home. She'd gone home. The aircraft had earned its place in history. The rest was just interpretation. Years later, retired at last with 25 years of service and more memories than she knew what to do with, Raina visited the museum alone. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, the kind of time when tourists were scarce and the galleries echoed with emptiness. She found her A-10 where they'd placed it, illuminated by carefully arranged spotlights that made the damage look almost artistic. The placard had been updated, she noticed. Now it mentioned her name, her rank, the specifics of the mission. She read it like reading about a stranger, someone who'd done something remarkable in another lifetime. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, stood nearby with her father, both of them studying the aircraft with serious attention. "Did the pilot die?" the girl asked, her voice carrying in the quiet gallery. The father checked the placard. "No, honey, she brought it home. Flew at 60 miles with all that damage." The girl looked at the missing wing section, at the holes in the scorched metal, her expression skeptical. "That's impossible." Her father smiled, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Most impossible things are, until someone does them." Raina watched them move on to the next exhibit, feeling something settle in her chest that might have been peace or might have been acknowledgement. The story would outlive her now, preserved in metal and museum placards and the mythology of military service. Whether she'd been brave or foolish, heroic or lucky, ultimately mattered less than the fact that she'd done what the moment required when the moment required it. That's all any of us can do, she thought. Show up. Do the work. Trust that it means something. She placed one hand on the aircraft's scarred fuselage, feeling the cold metal that had once been hot with friction and fire, that had carried her through sky and smoke, and the narrow space between life and death. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to the aircraft or the engineers or the universe that had allowed them both to survive. Maybe all three. Maybe it didn't matter. She'd learned over the years that gratitude doesn't require a clear recipient, just an honest heart. Raina left the museum as afternoon light slanted through the high windows, painting shadows that looked like wings across the polished floors. Outside, the Nevada sun was bright and indifferent, the sky impossibly blue, the kind of blue that made you want to fly just to be part of it. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, tilted her face toward that sky, and smiled. Somewhere, younger pilots were taking off on missions that would test them in ways they couldn't predict. Somewhere, aircraft were being damaged and repaired, flown and maintained, preserved and scrapped in the endless cycle of military service. And somewhere in the middle of all that, someone was making an impossible choice, trusting that skill and luck and stubborn determination might be enough to bring them home. Raina hoped they made it, hoped their aircraft held together just long enough, hoped someone would be waiting on the ground to tell them they'd done something worth remembering. Because in the end, that's what military service is. Thousands of individual moments where people choose to show up, to push through fear and exhaustion, and the very real possibility that today is the day the math stops working in their favor. Most of those moments pass unnoticed. A few become stories, and occasionally, very occasionally, one becomes legend. Raina climbed into her car, started the engine, and drove away from the museum without looking back. The sky followed her west, vast and blue and full of possibilities. Somewhere in that sky, her ghost was still flying, would always be flying, preserved in story and memory, and the hearts of people who needed to believe that impossible things were just difficult things that required enough stubbornness to see them through. She'd been many things in her life: daughter, pilot, mother, officer, survivor. But in the end, the thing she was most proud of was simpler than all of that. She'd been someone who didn't quit when quitting made sense. Someone who brought her people home. Someone who proved that being underestimated was just another form of tactical advantage, if you were willing to do the work to prove them wrong. The Air Force would continue without her, training new pilots, flying new missions, writing new stories of courage and sacrifice that would be retold in ready rooms for generations. Her chapter was finished, preserved in metal and memory, and the quiet satisfaction of service rendered. That was enough, more than enough. As Raina merged onto the highway, heading home to the family she'd sometimes left behind to serve, she allowed herself one final thought about that day over Cunnar Valley, about the choice that had defined her legacy. She'd do it again. Given the same circumstances, the same stakes, the same impossible situation, she'd make the exact same call. Not because it was smart or because it was safe, but because it was right. And in the space between those warning lights and that runway, between the moment of impact and the moment of landing, she'd learned the only lesson that really mattered. That sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph is nothing more than refusing to accept that the story's over until you've written the ending yourself.